Chapter 15, Sloth Sighting. A short way down the block they found the source of the scream, an elderly lady who was leaning on the handles of her walker, her eyes staring into space as if they were made of glass. "That's Mrs. Foote," Pearl told Ben as they ran toward her. "She's the oldest person in Buttonville. She doesn't like me because I broke her garden gnome." "How did you do that?" Ben asked. The contents of the Sasquatch catching kit jiggled with his frantic steps. He was a bit worried the motion might activate the fog bomb. "It was an accident," Pearl explained. "I wanted to get a nest that was in Mrs. Foote's tree to add to my nest collection, but it was way up in the top branch. So I climbed the tree, but then the branch broke and I fell right on top of the gnome. Its head came off." Mrs. Foote stood in her front yard next to her white picket fence. Dozens of colorfully painted gnomes dotted her yard as if they'd sprouted like weeds. The headless one still sat beneath the tree. Mrs. Foote's bony fingers gripped the handles of her walker as she stared down the sidewalk. "Hello, Mrs. Foote," Pearl said. "We heard a scream." A strangled sound emerged from Mrs. Foote's mouth, as if a word was trying to form deep down inside her. "Sssss." Pearl poked the lady's arm. "Are you okay?" The sound got louder. "Sssss." "I bet she's trying to say Sasquatch," Ben whispered to Pearl. "She must know where it is." "Mrs. Foote, what did you see?" Pearl poked her again. "Did you see something big and hairy?" Ben asked. Yes, Mrs. Foote said with trembling lips. "I saw a sloth." "A sloth?" Pearl and Ben said at the same time. Mrs. Foote finally blinked. Then she took a long, wheezy breath, and her eyes went wild, spinning around like they might fly right out of her head. "A terrible, enormous, hairy sloth right here in Buttonville. It tried to eat me." "Are you sure it was a sloth?" Ben asked. He was pretty sure that sloths didn't live in North America, and he was doubly sure that if Mrs. Foote had seen something terrible, enormous, and hairy, it was most likely the escaped Sasquatch. But events had been so strange lately, he couldn't be 100% certain of anything. "Tell us what happened," Pearl said. Mrs. Foote looked up at the tree branch that loomed overhead. "I was on my way to the senior center. It's pudding day, and I wanted to get some butterscotch before Maybelle ate it all. She's always hogging the butterscotch. But I heard a strange sound, and there it was, sitting in that tree." Ben walked around the tree where he found a big footprint pressed into the matted grass, and there, dangling from a low branch, a tuft of brown fur. He fluffed up the grass, then grabbed the fur to hide the evidence. "The sloth jumped out of the tree and snatched my sunbonnet right off my head. Then it ran toward Fur Street." Mrs. Foote patted her white hair. "That was my favorite sunbonnet." Ben didn't point out to Mrs. Foote that sloths are famous for moving very slowly, not for jumping or running. But if she wanted to believe that a sloth had taken her sunbonnet, and so be it. At least she didn't think it was a Sasquatch. Mrs. Foote squinted at Pearl. "Pearl Petal? Is that you? Did you do this?" "Do what?" Pearl asked. "Did you put a sloth in my tree?" Mrs. Foote wagged a finger at Pearl. "You have a reputation for trouble, young lady. You should stop messing around in people's trees." "I didn't," Pearl insisted. "Really, I didn't." "I'd better call the police," Mrs. Foote said. "They should know that there's a sloth on the loose in Buttonville." She turned her walker and began shuffling toward her house. "Should we stop her?" Ben asked. "Don't worry about it," Pearl said, as she started down the sidewalk. "The police will never believe her. Would you believe it if the oldest person in Buttonville told you that a sloth had jumped out of a tree and stolen her sunbonnet?" "No," Ben said as he followed. "Kind of sounds like one of my stories." "You write stories?" Pearl asked. "I tell stories. I don't write them." "Oh, you mean you lie." "I don't lie," Ben insisted. "I tell stories. There's a difference." But his mother and father had both warned him that if he kept telling his stories instead of telling the truth, people would stop believing anything he said. Look, Pearl said. She collected a tuft of brown fur that clung to a fire hydrant. They found another stuck on a rose bush. We're on the right track. A horn sounded and a blue and white police car pulled up to the curb. The words Buttonville Police Force were painted on the side. Crud. It's Aunt Millie. Act natural, Pearl told Ben. How are you supposed to act natural when you're looking for a Sasquatch? Ben wondered. The window rolled down and the police officer stuck out her head. Hiya, Pearl. Who's your friend?